Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Asian Development Bank's first virtual dialogue on resilient infrastructure for 2021. We have an exciting session planned for today and look forward to your participation. My name is Vivian Castro Wooldridge, and I'm a Senior Urban Development Specialist with ADB's Pacific Department, and I'll be your moderator for this webinar. Last year, as part of the series, we had the opportunity to hear from experts and practitioners on the foundations for understanding the fundamental concepts and global, regional, and national perspectives towards building resilient infrastructure. We looked at efforts to enhance the resilience of infrastructure to disasters and climate change through innovative and effective measures to evaluate multi-hazard risk in the face of increasing uncertainties. And we heard about solutions for enhancing climate and disaster resilience in infrastructure design standards, nature-based solutions, and early warning systems. During the first season of 2021, we'll be focusing on sector-specific aspects, with sessions covering urban, water, energy, and transport. Each session will be jointly organized with respective sector groups from ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. So we start today with business unusual for resilient urban infrastructure, organized in conjunction with the Urban Sector Working Group. We have a great lineup today of experts and practitioners to discuss opportunities to accelerate innovation for resilient urban infrastructure. Before we get started, allow me to share the house rules. Please remain on mute throughout the presentations, and your questions and comments are very welcome. I encourage you to please use the chat bar, and we'll keep an eye on what's coming in. Later in the session, we'll split into breakout rooms to look at the topics in more detail. Once the breakout rooms are opened, you'll receive a join a breakout room notification on the bottom toolbar to join your preferred group. For your info, this webinar is being recorded and the video will be shared on the event website along with the presentations and a summary in the next day or so. Before we proceed further, we have a poll to get your views. The question is, what capacity for resilient urban infrastructure planning is currently the weakest? There are 5 options, as you can see here on the screen, and you'll have about a minute to respond. So I'll just read them out. The first one is climate and disaster risk assessment. 2, climate proofing measures. 3, nature-based solutions. 4, economic and financial tools. Just please disregard the typo. Or 5, other. So please select one that represents your strongest view, and we'll give you about a minute. If we have some good responses, maybe we can go ahead and close, Sugar. Go ahead. Okay, so others, not too much there, but we can see that nature-based solutions comes out quite strongly, but so do the other 3. But nature-based solutions, does come out ahead of the others. So thank you for your participation in that poll. Good to just get a little bit of people's views before we get right into it. So now moving along, and to help us frame today's session, it's my pleasure to invite Manoj Sharma to set the scene. Manoj is the Chief of the Urban Sector Group at ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Manoj leads ADB's efforts on making cities more livable, following a cross-sector and cross-thematic approach of providing integrated solutions. Manoj has 28 years of experience working with ADB and the Government of India. Manoj, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Vivian, Virinder, Ramon, and everyone from both Urban Sector Group and CCDRM Group. Yeah, so first of all, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all the participants. I'm delighted to see this unusual topic of business unusual for resilient urban infrastructure. I'm also looking at the 2 objectives, which are quite relevant and important. First one on new ways of advancing resilience of urban infrastructure, and the second one on new approaches of mainstreaming resilience in the urban space. So very much looking forward to our discussions today in this webinar on these two important objectives. Next, please. Let me start with the challenges which we all are quite familiar with. Urbanization, especially in developing member countries, is one of the most significant global trends, and it's going to define the future. Urban populations in Asia and the Pacific increased from about 20% in 1950s to about 50% in 2020. By 2030, these cities in our countries are projected to have 55% of the region's population. That's an estimated 2.5 billion people. Most cities in ADB's developing member countries face inadequate urban services and deficits in basic urban infrastructure. Already a huge challenge before COVID-19, as all of us must have witnessed. This lack of adequate urban services, coupled with the existing threat on climate change and the new threat of the pandemic, has placed our cities in the member countries at a great disadvantage. If you look at the bottom part of this slide, cities consume about 60% to 80% of the total energy supply. 40% of natural disasters occur in our region, and Asia and the Pacific is home to 6 of the 10 of the most vulnerable countries. Let me give some figures also to put the requirements of infrastructure in perspective. Our ERCD department did a study recently, and as per our assessment, our region will need to invest around 26.2 trillion US dollars from 2016 to 2030. This translates to 1.7 trillion US dollars per year for infrastructure to maintain growth, eradicate poverty, and respond to climate change. Most of it is going to be in urban space. So this is a huge challenge and a huge investment requirement, but at the same time, great opportunity for all of us to mainstream resilience in infrastructure planning and implementation. And that's why today's webinar becomes so critically important. Next, please. So how is ADB supporting the developing countries in our region to address these challenges? Just want to refer to ADB Strategy 2030, which you must be quite familiar with by now. This is our long-term strategic framework. Our vision is to achieve a prosperous, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable Asia and the Pacific. So how do we propose to add value to our stakeholders in our member countries? The answer is quite simple. It's finance plus plus. The first plus is for knowledge, and second plus is for partnership. If you look at the document, which I will urge you to do after the webinar, or maybe during the webinar, there are 7 operational priorities in this document. Just to refresh our memories on these priorities, the first one is on poverty and inequality. Second one is on gender equality. Third one is on climate change, disaster resilience, and environmental sustainability. The fourth one, on which I'll talk a little bit more, is on making cities more livable. The other important priorities are rural development and food security, governance, and regional cooperation and integration. So the strategy 2030 revolves around these 7 operational priorities and how we are going to implement them until 2030. Next, please. A little bit more on our favorite operational priority on making cities more livable. So what's our definition of livable cities in ADB? We call a city livable if it is green, competitive, inclusive, and resilient. The resilient part is very important, as we'll see during the course of this webinar. It also supports cities to develop the right institutions, policies, and enabling environments to become more livable. If you look at the bottom part of this slide, there are 3 important pillars, and I'll only talk about the third one. That's on urban environment, climate resilience, and disaster management of cities improved. That's an important pillar under Operation Priority 4 on livable cities and becoming more and more critical nowadays. Next, please. If you look at ADB's urban sector project commitments in 2020, urban water supply is still the largest component at 39%, followed by urban sewerage and sanitation at 32%, and urban flood protection at 7%. So overall, about 78% of our projects are related to water and wastewater. I'm not counting transport and energy here, which also have substantive urban component in their portfolio. An important point to note here is that portfolio includes substantive soft component of urban policy, institutional capacity development, which is around 10%. In terms of regional distribution, South Asia captures the maximum share at 45%, followed by Southeast Asia at 17%. Next, please. This is ADB's resilience framework. It's a very nice framework which captures the systemic and interconnected elements of urban resilience principles. It's quite useful in terms of describing the 4 dimensions of resilience. First one on physical resilience, second one on ecological resilience, third one on social and institutional resilience, and finally the financial resilience. Now, if we plan to apply these urban climate change resilience principles to our projects and programs, we have to look at the right entry points, some of which could be nature-based solutions, flood forecasting and early warning systems, healthy and age-friendly cities, air quality management, low carbon transformation, disaster risk financing, urban energy and clean technologies, water and sanitation, which of course is a major part of our portfolio, and flood risk management, to name a few. There are several other such entry points for incorporating climate change resilience principles. In addition, in ADB and our member countries need to pay more attention to innovative resilience solutions also in areas like climate proofing of infrastructure, community-based adaptation, smart technology adaptation applications, and greater private sector involvement. One point which I would like to highlight is about strong focus on the toolkits like geospatial information system, and I am sure we'll talk more about the SPADE tool, which our team has developed in SDCC, and it's being used by our member countries and regional departments. Such tools help us in upstream analytical work, in preparing projects, enhancing readiness, and monitoring implementation of our projects during the execution stage. Next, please. As we all know, cities are at the forefront of the COVID-19 crisis. With more than 90% of COVID-19 cases occurring in cities, the impacts of the pandemic are most felt by the residents of the cities. Next, please. And quite clearly, post-pandemic, cities are going to see lasting and irreversible changes. These will range from cities' planning systems and densities to their economic and community structures and social behaviors and urban governance in general. Just to state quite the obvious, cities across the world will need to be more resilient to future shocks caused not only by climate change and disasters, but also by pandemics and other similar disruptive events. So in the immediate terms, as we have all seen during the last 1 year, cities need to provide emergency response to their residents. But at the same time, in the medium and long term, they need to build back better to be able to address such challenges because of pandemics and similar disruptive events. So ADB has recently prepared a guidance note on post-COVID-19 new normals, which guides cities for both the emergency response in the immediate term and also build back better in the short and medium term. This guidance note describes 6 different approaches, and I request the team to share this guidance note along with the Operation Priority 4 document to the participants. Just to refresh a bit, in the interest of the time, I'll only focus on the pillar 3 of Operation Priority 4 and the last 2 new normal approaches, the 5th one and the 6th one, which 5th one is on healthy and environmentally sustainable cities, and the 6th new normal approach is on building resilient cities with the ability to absorb shocks and stresses due to pandemics, disasters, and climate change. The guidance note provides advice on how these approaches could be translated into action in our urban infrastructure projects. Next, please. So this is the last slide for me, and I would like to leave the participants with a few important questions. So the first important question is on business unusual. That's how we started. So what exactly business unusual mean for resilient urban infrastructure? That's an important point of discussion. The second point is on best practices. So what are the best practices and new approaches for transformative urban infrastructure planning and increased resilience, which is becoming much more pertinent in the wake of the pandemic? The third question is on scaling up and replication. So how can the infrastructure resilience be scaled up from community to urban landscape And from pilots and demonstration, which we have seen in plenty, to mainstreaming the urban resilience in all our projects in ADB and outside ADB with other development partners and in our member countries. Next question is on tools. So what resilience planning tools are important for building capacity of our colleagues in ADB, but more importantly of our cities in member countries? And the final question I want to leave you with is on the benefits and its measurement. So how can infrastructure resilience benefits be properly measured and reflected in project viability studies? We are all aware of the requirements of FIRR and EIRR, economic internal rate of return, and the difficulties we face in measuring and incorporating the benefits of infrastructure resilience in calculating EIRR. So I can see a lot of interest from the participants in all these questions and the approaches, and to learning new ways of mainstreaming resilience in our urban infrastructure. So I'll stop here with conveying my best wishes for fruitful and productive discussions in this webinar. Thank you very much, and over to you, Vivian. Thank you.
Thank you, Manoj, for these excellent questions you closed with, which give us some food for thought for the breakout sessions and in general, as we aim to do more and better. Thank you also for setting the stage and sharing the existing ADB materials that we can use as references, and also for stressing the scale and urgency of the challenges we're facing, which require us to shift into business unusual mode and away from the status quo. So it's a given that we're on a trajectory of greater urbanization, and all people in our cities require services. So we need to ensure that the infrastructure being developed or enhanced does in fact contribute to resilience and does not increase fragility in an already fragile context. So that closes our opening session. And now we move on to our Burst Talks segment, which we expect to give us some good takeaways. And we'll be hearing more about nature-based solutions too, which came out on top as an area of weak capacity in our opening poll. The first Burst Talk on risk-informed urban infrastructure planning, applying climate and disaster risk information, will be made by Alexander Nash from the Asian Development Bank. Alex is a chartered chemical engineer specialized in water management and urban development. He has more than 20 years professional experience working with utilities, multilateral financing institutions, and governments on water, sanitation, and irrigation infrastructure projects. Alex is currently project officer for 3 ADB projects in Cambodia and Vietnam, which include implementing new approaches in nature-based infrastructure, smart city initiatives, and disaster risk financing. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Vivian. Hi, everyone. Thanks for giving up some of your precious time today and showing some interest in what we've got to in our work. I'll share my screen. Okay. So risk-informed urban infrastructure planning. Let me start a timer so I don't bore you for too long. Applying climate and disaster risk information. Okay, there's a lot in that title, risk, urban infrastructure and planning, and using risk. So I thought I'd share some thoughts about those topics, and then we can talk about a concrete project that we're doing. Okay, there we go. Planning. Okay, there's two big things in popular wisdom about planning, and they're sort of contradictory. One is that plans do not survive contact with the enemy, and so they're sort of worthless. And the other one is that planning failing to plan is planning to fail. We reconcile those two bits of wisdom can be reconciled in the understanding that planning isn't an output. It's actually not a destination. It's really like a process or a journey. And so planning is important, obviously, but the key takeaway I think from it is really that plans are a journey, right? So they need to be flexible and they need to be able to deal with new information. And we see that are in our projects all the time, which take a long time from conception to finish. New information is coming in all the time. And if your projects and your plans cannot deal with it and cannot deal with the fact that some of your assumptions will be wrong, then your projects you'll be building a solution which is no longer applicable. It was the solution to a problem that is already stale or outdated. And so investments which can deal with updated information or even deal with changes to assumptions which were erroneous or resilient to that end up being no regret investments or resilient investments. So that's just something to consider, is what happens to our plan when this information changes? Can the plan change? So we try to get our plans to be able to update quickly as new information comes to light. Risk is the next element of this talk. And so here's an example on the screen of one of our projects in Cambodia, in Kampong Chhnang, where we've done some flood modeling. So, I mean, normal infrastructure planning or when you're urban planning obviously takes into account risks, because you're building infrastructure to mitigate risks and deliver services. So that's sort of business as usual, I would say. As most people will know, to take into account and expected impacts of climate change, there are a bunch of climate models which have been developed and scenarios, and those can be used to predict, to model your infrastructure under future circumstance rather than historic climate data. So we take historic climate data and we adjust it for what we think will happen in the future, depending how pessimistic or optimistic our climate change scenarios are. So that, I think, is fairly standard practice. Here, the example I'm presenting is an example of taking two risks rather than just one. So risks, they're not unidimensional. Often when things go wrong, they can go wrong, more than one thing can go wrong at a time. And so when we're doing our risk modeling, it's useful to consider multiple overlapping risks. And the example on the screen is a river level rise, or the lake level rising due to the annual flooding of the Mekong, which happens every season anyway. But combined with an intense period of local rainfall. And so then you have two overlapping effects, and you can see that it gives, it gives you an idea of what's going to happen. And so when you do that, that will inform your infrastructure planning. Here is an example of a project in Persat in Cambodia, where we're building a wastewater treatment plant, stormwater drainage, among other things. When you apply that modeling, you can determine how high should our wastewater treatment plant really be elevated so that it can survive a flood. And we determined how high that should be. And here you can see we didn't actually have to wait very long to find out whether our modeling was right or wrong, because there was a record flood in August last year. And you can see in the picture on the left, that's the center of town. The river embankment is being overtopped, which is quite rare. And on the right is our wastewater treatment plant, which looks like an island in the flood. So we got that right. And that makes, clearly makes the infrastructure, it'll be able to keep performing its job during the flood, which is particularly important given that it's wastewater treatment, and when there's water everywhere, where we don't want untreated wastewater everywhere as well. So to move away from the project specifics back to sort of generalities, one of the things, I suppose, that is business unusual or is like a new approach to risk-informed infrastructure planning is the idea that a narrow focus on infrastructure is a mistake, and building a bigger pipe or a higher embankment can increase fragility rather than decrease it. That's sort of counterintuitive, and I would say that's a new way of looking at risk. Now, historically, the solution has been build a bigger pipe, or build a higher embankment. But, the counterintuitive element is that when an asset becomes viewed as infallible, it increases our fragility and it allows us to, lower our guard. Whether you want it or not, unconsciously you do. When people sort of know that there's a massive embankment or a massive pipe that's been built, they think, okay, well, that's always going to work. That's never going to fail. And then people neglect other sorts of investments or backup plans, which are the true source of resilience. So the example in the picture is, you don't put lifeguards on lifeboats on an unsinkable ship, or enough lifeboats. And a more pertinent one is, Hurricane Katrina, where George Bush said people didn't anticipate a breach of the levees. That was sort of seen as the solution, which will protect the city. And you have all your eggs in those baskets. So Resilience, I mean, this is sort of the view now is it's actually derived from not trying to build an infallible asset, but actually having some slack and some redundancy, and perhaps accept a smaller primary defense asset and use the savings to buy backup plans, multiple backup plans. We are doing that in Cambodia actually. So, you know, let's just assume that our embankment and our modeling was wrong, or something goes wrong, somebody doesn't maintain it, or something unanticipated happens and it fails. What will happen then is the question we need to be asking. So, you know, do we have boats to rescue people? Are the disaster coordination centers above the flood level? Can we raise them? That's actually quite cheap to do. And so it's a shame not to. And, you know, in Hurricane Katrina, the disaster response teams were flooded. They were below the flood level. And so that you know, that's a relatively cheap thing that you can do to improve resilience. And so that's what we're doing: radios, generators, multifunctionality of assets, which we'll talk about later. For example, nature-based solutions. That's also considered to be something that improves resilience rather than specialization. Assets which can do multiple things, and this is mainly because you don't actually necessarily know where your risk will materialize from. You probably know the big ones, but when things go wrong, you know, they tend to go wrong from an unexpected direction. And so if your assets can perform multiple functions, then maybe perchance one of their functions will actually defend you from that unexpected risk. And the last one I want to mention before I run out of time is social capital. When I was preparing this presentation, I realized that this is something that engineers like me, we don't really talk about or think about. We tend to be antisocial, but actually what makes a city resilient is social capital. It's not a levee or a pipe or a dike or whatever. And if you like, Hurricane Katrina's failures were largely social failures. And so I think one of the things we should be thinking about is what infrastructure can we build that improves social capital? And it's quite different from, you know, building an embankment or a pipe or whatever. Because when things go wrong, our biggest source of resilience is actually how well we stick together as a community and how well we help one another. That is how we will save the most lives and reduce the most risk for other people. And so to that extent, assets which reduce, you know, insecurity, inequality, marginalization, create public space, public good, sense of community, those are things which will create a sense of resilience, which I think don't tend to get talked about in climate resilience discussions, but actually that is the glue that will hold us together and get us through flooding events. And so we are trying to do that in our projects in Cambodia, find their marginal groups of people living, squatting on sides of embankments, convincing the government that those people, we need to serve those people. They are, you know, we need to bring them into the circle of trust that is the citizens. And we think that sort of investment as well makes the city much more resilient, you know, stick together when that disaster happens and the other infrastructure we built doesn't work for whatever reason. And so we think they're good investments too, and they're not necessarily very costly. I'll stop there because I think I've used up my time. And that way, I think Vivian's is right. We can, if anybody has any spontaneous comments, we can take them.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Alex. So if anyone has any questions from the floor, you may raise your hand or go ahead and speak while introducing yourself, perhaps, before posing your question. Let's see, I can't see their hands. Anyone have their hand up? Looks like no. Well, we'll have time also in the breakout.
That was 10 minutes in the end, actually, so we could move on.
I mean, that's fine. Thanks a lot. I mean, I appreciate how you stress that the thinking now is that a narrow focus on infrastructure is risky, and, you know, stressing the need for multidimensional approaches and importance of social capital. Yeah, why don't we move on to the second burst talk, and then we'll have time later for more discussion. So the second burst talk on infrastructure for urban resilience, integrating gray and nature-based solutions, will be made by Carrie Burge from Monash University. Carrie is the project manager for the co-design and build component of the Revitalizing Informal Settlements and Their Environments, or RISE program in Indonesia, as well as playing a key role in the delivery of the co-design and design development in Fiji. Carrie is a water-sensitive urban design practitioner specializing in the water-sensitive cities approach to development. She has more than 18 years experience in the water sector across both consulting and academia. Carrie's experience ranges from detailed design of nature-based solutions and green technologies and their integration with traditional gray infrastructure and smart technologies through to policy and planning and the development of robust social safeguards to support a community development approach. Carrie, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Vivian, and thank you everyone for joining. I'll just share my screen here. Does that look okay, Vivian?
Yeah,
Yep.
that's good.
Excellent.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, like I said, thanks everyone for joining. I just thought to start off, it would be important to introduce to you the RISE program. It is an action research program operating in Makassar in Indonesia and Suva in Fiji. And RISE is undertaking a randomised control trial of 24 informal settlements, so 12 in each city, looking at the environmental and human health benefits of informal settlement upgrading using a water sensitive approach, which includes nature-based solutions or green infrastructure. So a lot of the experiences I'll be drawing on from today are through our work in Makassar, Indonesia to date. So what are some of the emerging approaches for integrating nature-based solutions in planning and implementing urban infrastructure at the community level? So delivering integrated infrastructure at any level, particularly in retrofit scenarios, can be a real challenge. It's not a challenge that's limited to nature-based solutions. The delivery of traditional infrastructure in this situation, in these retrofit situations, particularly in dense urban environments, is really, really tricky. Even traditional grey infrastructure, such as large-scale wastewater treatment systems and networks, can suffer from low uptake rates when it comes to household connections because of poor community buy-in and users not seeing the value of connecting to the system. So one way to overcome this is to apply a community co-design approach where residents are partners in the planning and the decision-making. In RISE, for example, the co-design process gives residents a voice and a chance to share their visions for the future. It's a discussion that's more than just water management and green infrastructure. While being clear about what the program can provide, there's space to discuss the everyday challenges of residents and understand the outcomes and infrastructure delivery that they see as critical to improve their day-to-day lives. Throughout the co-design process in Indonesia, the team regularly get feedback from residents that nobody has ever actually asked them what they want and what they need to improve their day-to-day lives. And that even applies in communities that have received community level infrastructure in the past. So the co-design process that's used in RISE aims to empower residents to make informed choices. So by building a shared understanding of what makes people sick and explaining how nature-based solutions work, they work together as co-collaborators and designers. And as a result, we've already seen that we can generate genuine local ownership of those assets. So working together to locate this infrastructure, it's not just for water and sanitation, but placemaking and design of future community spaces generates that buy-in and a shared sense of responsibility for the success of the project. And that's really critical for the long-term operation and maintenance and long-term success. So from a technical perspective, how can we deliver a resilient urban infrastructure at the community scale? So what we've learned so far is that implementing infrastructure at the community level means contextualising that infrastructure for a given set of circumstances. Often if we consider nature-based solutions as standalone solutions, there's many situations where the introduction of that infrastructure, green infrastructure, is just not feasible. And that's particularly so in situations like urban informal settlements, where many of the settlements are located low in the landscape in areas that are difficult to service because of the density and the topography. So in this context, it's a combination of green infrastructure and traditional grey infrastructure, as well as smart technology, that provide a real opportunity to service these vulnerable communities. While nature-based solutions like constructed wetlands and biofilters are at the heart of those solutions, it's a combination of grey and green and smart that really increases the flexibility of those designs and allows the infrastructure to reach the poorest and most vulnerable communities. Of course, when we're talking about these types of new infrastructure, for example, the smart technologies, they're not new, they're well tested in other parts of the world. But of course, the next step is to transition this responsibility over to local agencies. And the way that these smart technologies work means that this can be done over a long period of time with a long period of shared responsibility to ensure local agencies before they take it on themselves. So the benefits of including nature-based solutions in these type of interventions. If we combine grey and green and smart infrastructure with nature-based solutions at the heart of the design, we can have multiple citywide benefits. So that includes things like reduced urban heat impacts, improved flood management, reduced pollution in downstream waterways, and reduced impacts of drought. But we can also have increase in the neighbourhood or household resilience. So this is including through improved drainage, using fit for purpose water supply, and providing multiple sources to increase resilience, and utilising wastewater as a resource for economic activities. Integrated infrastructure can also have much smaller scale benefits that really meaningfully impact the day-to-day lives of residents. An example that's shown in this picture is at the RISE demonstration project, the delivery of the integrated water and sanitation infrastructure that uses constructed wetlands included a raised pathway to improve access during the wet season. And that design was done together with the communities and it highlighted their preferences and their desires for infrastructure in their community. And as a result of that improved access, the fishmonger and other vendors regularly come down that street now, and it allows the residents to purchase food at their doorstep, which is something they could never have done before. And I think also importantly, specific to RISE, is because it's part of a broader research program looking at the environmental and human health benefits of this approach. It is small scale, but the data collected on the broader benefits to that environmental and human health, particularly for children under 5, will be critical in showing what those benefits for nature-based solutions are. And I'd just like to finish up in saying that including decentralised nature-based solutions as part of a suite of solutions that include also traditional grey and smart technologies provides the opportunity to channel funds to deliver services in areas that are really difficult to surface using a traditional infrastructure approach. That means we can reach more of the poorest and most vulnerable populations. And it's these populations who are becoming more poorer and more vulnerable as a result of the COVID pandemic, and who could perhaps benefit the most from an approach to service delivery that includes a combination of grey and green and smart infrastructure. In terms of the costs to deliver, for RISE, we're still in the early days. We do have some costing information, having completed our demonstration projects and estimates for larger 6 sites that we're working in. And the cost per household is similar to the delivery of a citywide sewer network and wastewater treatment plant. But I think it's also important to note that it's not really comparing apples with apples. This approach includes things like private toilets for households that don't have access to a toilet, improved drainage, improved access in flooded areas, as well as water supply and sanitation. And lastly, the reality is that most of these settlements would not be serviced by the traditional method in the next 3 or 4 decades. So it's simply not a choice of which one. There isn't any other options here. So this is a complementary. We need more tools in our toolbox to deliver services to the urban poor. And we see that this is a really good complementary approach to some perhaps more traditional ones.
Great, thank you, Carrie. Really great presentation. And we can see some common themes emerging from your talk and Alex's talk on how to move towards business unusual, moving beyond only climate proofing and strengthening social capital for building resilience, especially of the most vulnerable people, and also the multi-pronged approaches. Any questions for Carrie from the floor? I think go ahead and speak if you have a question. Otherwise, we can move on to our third and final burst talk. So the third burst talk on measuring the benefits of investing in resilient infrastructure to demonstrate social, economic, and environmental impact will be made by Matthew Savage. Matthew is director of Oxford Consulting Partners. He's a leading expert on the economics of resilience and has undertaken economic appraisal on more than 2 billion of climate programming under the UK International Climate Fund. He is currently seconded to the COP26 team to support preparations for the UK presidency, and he has been involved in several studies looking at the economics of climate change at national and regional levels in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Vivian?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'll just start off with a bit of an overview of the project which I'm engaged in, which is the Urban Climate Change Resilient Trust Fund embedded within the ADB. And this is a $150 million fund which is financed by the UK government, Switzerland, Rockefeller, which aims to provide additional support to ADB lending operations in the urban context to promote the uptake and mainstreaming of climate resilience measures, operating in 8 countries, 70 cities in total, and it's been going for about 4 or 5 years now. Okay, so within that program, we have an economics stream, which is looking to understand the costs and benefits of investing in or mainstreaming resilience in the urban context. And we've taken a portfolio of 25 cities across the 8 countries. And what we're really interested in is not only the hard infrastructure, so there's obviously a program of resilient roads, storm shelters, embankments, drainage, solid waste management, but also the planning and policy support that goes into municipal authorities to help them build their capacity and readiness for disaster response or resilience planning. And we're looking at this as a sort of as an integrated package. And I think, as Alex was saying, it's difficult to try and separate out the infrastructure as a standalone. This is part of a more integrated approach. So, I mean, why are we doing this? I mean, I'm sure people's eyes start to glaze over when you start talking about economic appraisal and economic rates of return and all of these things. But really, economics is at the heart of building the business case for understanding resilience. And both the people who fund resilience, so on the financial side or on the donor side, but also the recipient countries, so borrower countries, want to understand that there is a strong business case, a strong financial and economic case for spending this money. And there's always reticence for spending additional money when the benefits are uncertain. So the economics is a way of describing what those benefits are. And perhaps more importantly, it's a way of asking the questions, again, something which Alex touched on, about are we making the right designs and decisions. So it's a way of describing the choices and the options which are open to you. And I would encourage people who are doing project design and delivery within ADB not to see the economics as a box that you have to tick to get project approval, but a way of describing the theory of transformation, the theory of resilience change that you want to see within the project. So how are we doing this? Well, what we're not doing is detailed economic modeling in each of these 25 cities, because these are fairly substantial pieces of work, and pieces of work that you would normally do alongside a much larger investment. So rather what we're trying to do is to find a way of capturing the costs and benefits of this large portfolio of projects and interventions at a slightly higher level using existing tools and data sets. So these are sort of the 4 steps within an economic appraisal approach. We have firstly the socioeconomic. So what do these cities look like? How many people live there? What's the national income or the per capita income? What are the asset values? How much money is being spent on resilience? And where do vulnerable groups live? We then have a sort of set of climate impacts. So what are the hazards and how often do these hazards occur? On what scale? What's the data on economic losses? And how do we value non-infrastructure or non-hard infrastructure losses? The third question is, we then ask ourselves, well, how is this likely to change over time in terms of the impacts? And often what you find is that within economic appraisal on climate impacts, the main driver of future risk is not future climate. It's obviously a driver, but a bigger driver is an increase in population or sort of urban migration or increases in asset values within urban contexts. So there's basically greater exposure within those urban contexts. So the future risk and losses are a combination between climate change and urban development. So we need to have some view on the future development pathways for these cities. And then the fourth set of questions we've got are, well, if we build these roads or water drainage projects, what are likely to be the benefits of these projects? And that is challenging in a way because the frequency and severity of events in the future is not an exact science. There are probabilistic models that you can use to suggest what the return period for a flood will be. But it's unlikely, unless you're very lucky, again, like Alex, that your infrastructure will be tested within the lifetime of a project and its development. So you're having to make forecasts based on historic data and updated climate models. So we've compiled a number of tools, and some of those are along the bottom of the screen, some of which are impact and hazard tools, some of which are historic databases of damage events, some climate models. And we're pulling these together to give an overview at sort of city level and at a portfolio of cities on where things are and what the likely costs and benefits are going to be. So if I take one example that we're looking at and we've just done a case study on, there are 2 cities in Bangladesh, Patuakhali and Bagarat, which have just been hit by super cyclone Amphan, and where we've been able to actually go in and look at the infrastructure that was built and the costs. And what we found there, interestingly, was that the impacts of this super cyclone had been much reduced compared to the last similar event, which was in 2007, and super cyclone Sidir. And there were still significant costs, so maybe up to $50 million identified in each city. But the number of deaths were significantly reduced across the municipal areas and the districts, potentially up to 90% compared to previous events. All of the infrastructure which the ADB had and the UCCRTF had supported survived intact, and not only that, provided strong resilience response benefits during the cyclone in terms of transport, moving people around, and the cyclone shelters. So the benefits that we found, or we estimate, were significantly in excess of the cost of the project. Potentially, I think, 2 to 3 times what it costs to put these resilient benefits in. I'm just going to finish with a couple of higher level reflections on what we're learning. So particularly in secondary cities where we're working, baselines and historic data are hard to come by in terms of economic costs. There are global databases, but they don't tend to have the granularity for smaller cities. So it's really important to understand where you're starting from in order to tell the story about the benefits that you get. The second point is that we're also seeing that within city contexts, you get higher concentrations of economic value at risk. And that's both asset values, it's more dense populations, and it's the agglomeration effects of urban environments. So the impacts within urban centres are higher than you will get at sort of district or provincial level. It's very, very concentrated, much in the same way that the COVID impacts are also concentrated in urban centres. We're finding good evidence that the benefits of smart resilience planning outweigh the costs. This requires sort of smart vulnerability and risk assessments and mainstreaming into planning, but this is often sort of low regret type activities. Again, picking up on something that Alex said, the social capital and the co-benefits are not well captured in economic appraisal. So, for example, the health, the transport, the economic benefits of resilience, particularly where there's multifunctionality. So, for example, shelters operating as schools or sort of medical facilities, where you can double up the resilience benefits. That's important. The penultimate point is perhaps the most important. Preparedness is better than response. And if you can mainstream your infrastructure planning alongside capacity building from municipal authorities to understand risk and understand their response plans, that has a potential to hugely reduce the economic impacts. So if you can move people, for example, in advance of an event, or if you can take precautions to foresee what these risks might be and put assets in place for response, that can significantly reduce the economic impacts. It's the lack of foresight which is an issue. So I'll finish just by saying that don't be frightened of economic appraisal, but see it as an opportunity to describe the value of the work that you're doing and broaden it out, not only to look at hard infrastructure losses, but also to think about the social and the welfare and the economic benefits, broader economic benefits of what you're doing and how that feeds into your economic assessment. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. And we have some questions in the chat box from Shan from FCDO. If you can respond to those, please. So she's asking, is it possible to disentangle climate from other impacts in order to estimate avoided loss and damage? And the other one is, what are the challenges involved in estimating what losses would have been incurred without the investment? Thanks for those comments in the chat box.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because if I'm honest, a lot of the damages which get incurred during a climate event are failures in governance and planning as much as they are in terms of climate impacts. So, for example, blockage of water drains by using solid waste. The issue may not be about sort of infrastructure. It may just be about sort of social capital or poor governance. So you're always operating with the climate lens on top of a sort of governance lens as well, which makes it difficult to change or difficult to disaggregate. But you are dealing with what you've got. So in a way, that is the baseline. In terms of projecting future losses, these are hypothetical baselines going forward. So you are being asked to project forward over the lifetime of the infrastructure, which could be 20, 30, 40 years. and using best available data on sort of historic trends and sort of future projections to come up with a best central scenario. But the honest truth is that scenario is a projection, it's not a prediction, which is why in economic appraisal, it's important not to try and show this as sort of the truth of what will happen and then what did happen with the project, but rather to use the appraisal as testing the thresholds over what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. So sort of maximum potential losses, and people need to become much more comfortable with working within ranges of uncertainty and probability. And I think at that point, economic appraisal would become a much more useful tool rather than this checkbox just to get a project approved.
I think there are maybe some new questions as well. I would suggest, because of time, that we take them up in the breakout room, if that's okay. But thanks for that. Thanks for contributing. And so thanks a lot, Matt. That was really great. And this closes the presentation segment of our webinar. And we'll now move into one of 3 breakout rooms to continue the discussion with Alex, Carrie, and Matthew, our 3 Burst Talk speakers, who will each moderate a breakout discussion. So it's a great opportunity to share new approaches and pilots on resilience in the urban space that are ready to be mainstreamed. And we have 3 rooms focusing on 1, applying climate and disaster risk information, 2, integrating gray and nature-based solutions, and 3, measuring the benefits of investing in resilient infrastructure. So in the breakout rooms, I encourage you to please turn on your camera if possible, but kindly remain on mute when not speaking. And after these 3 burst talks, I'm personally interested in hearing more about people's experience on getting buy-in from governments to use more nature-based solutions, and also strategies for us to be more effective advocates for building in more resilience into our projects, which often comes at an upfront opportunity cost perhaps, but with significant benefits. So please go ahead and click on the breakout room button on the bottom toolbar to open the breakout rooms list. And you can then select the breakout room you want to join by clicking on the join button next to it. If you don't have a preference or are facing technical challenges, we'll just move you into a room. So we'll convene back here in around 20 minutes to share some of the key takeaways. Thank you, and enjoy the breakout rooms. Ready to have a more detailed discussion in smaller groups. Sorry if you were cut off. But I'd like to now invite each of the presenters to share 2 or 3 main takeaways from the group discussions. And let's go ahead and start with group 1, Alex Nash, on applying climate and disaster risk information.
Oh,
right.
Thanks, Vivian.
Sorry.
No, look, I thought the survey at the beginning was really interesting. The strong interest in nature-based solutions, which I happen to work in, and so I was pleased that a lot of people think that's an issue, because it means I'm not wasting my time on something that people think is unimportant. But also because I agree that that is the area where there's sort of not, at least in the developing member countries, it's perhaps not getting the attention that it merits. And so we had a bit of discussion around how developers might use nature-based solutions and what sort of policies might push them in that direction, in the way that Singapore has successfully done. And then also Anne had a point about, is it realistic for, essentially, I'll summarize your point, Anne, which is that, is it realistic for, an ordinary municipality with their limited resources to do this sort of expensive and resource intensive modelling that we've managed to get done on some of our projects? And that's a valid point. And there's a bigger problem municipalities face, which is, do they have resources even for any planning or enforcement of any planning? And I think the solution to both of those problems is linked, which is that there's just this massive amount of geospatial information, which is now cascading from the thousands of satellites which are above us. It's public domain, it's higher and higher resolution, it's cheaper and cheaper, and it's more and more up to date. And that's stuff which just didn't exist 10 years ago or 20 years ago. When I started work, an anecdote, we in a city in North Africa, we had to commission a spot satellite to get us a photo, so we even knew what the city looked like. There weren't drones, there wasn't like, we couldn't just fly up a drone and do it. It cost 20,000 euros for us to do it. We got a snapshot, and then we had to work on that for the next 20 years. So it wasn't something you could, that's all changed now. We now have much more up-to-date information about how our cities are evolving, climate information, it's public domain, it's free. So I think that these technology changes will make available that sort of information. And the challenge for us is to, just make sense of that for our cities, get it into a format that people can understand and use and make it actionable rather than just be drowned in this crazy amount of data. And that's something we can deploy our resources on, such that any municipality which is interested in informing their planning through this stuff can just do it. They don't need to commission, a dedicated consultancy to produce $100,000, $200,000 study.
Thanks. Yeah, great, Alex. Carrie, if you can share some takeaways, please.
Sure, thanks, Vivian. So we talked about quite a few different things, but I think one of the things that stuck with me is, this challenge of getting buy-in and government buy-in, and how critical it is to have a demonstration site, and that has so many benefits to touch and feel, and really allow people to get a sense of what it looks like on the ground. And I think while going from demonstration to scale up is the next challenge, and it is a huge challenge, it still doesn't take away from the fact that we do need that demonstration on the ground to allow people to see what nature-based solutions look like and become familiar with them. We also talked about the costs, which is, of course, the conversation often turns to costs when we talk about nature-based solutions, particularly decentralized, and that we can't consider it as a cheap solution. It does cost money, and it will, while it is in a similar range to delivering traditional sanitation, there are these broader benefits that if we're able to really create that narrative, we can show that the benefits are there for that investment, even if they're less tangible. And I think we also talked about, I was mentioning that in our demonstration site, we've seen a huge amount of investment from the residents since the demonstration site infrastructure has been built. So we're trying to capture that at the moment to show that there is investment. It does bring investment into the community beyond what was spent on the infrastructure. And the last thing was a question around documentation of the different components of our toolbox, so to speak, of the different parts of the infrastructure. And I thought it was worth mentioning that we have developed these 3 knowledge products that will be launched next month that describe the overall approach that RISE has taken, that also describe in detail the co-design approach. And then there's one that describes the technical components. Thanks, Vivian.
Thanks, Carrie. Lots of good points there. Matthew, if you could share. Thank you.
Sure. So just a couple of things. So the first was we had a discussion on whether the climate finance targets that the NDBs have, including ADB, created perverse incentives to invest in higher cost solutions rather than some of the nature-based solutions or additional resilience elements, which may not tick the climate finance boxes or may not be as large. So if there's a sort of structural perverse incentive within that. Second point was really around how you deal with uncertainty and marginal costs and benefits of doing resilience, and the need to have good information before you try and answer these questions. And thirdly, we talked about the cultural shift within ADB from seeing the economic appraisal as a hurdle that you have to jump to get a project approved, really trying to describe a much broader set of benefits, and how by doing that you can start to influence the potential design. So if you're looking, for example, at the economic benefits that flow to communities from infrastructure, then it starts to open up potential channels for influencing project design and maximizing those benefit flows.
Great, thanks. Well, what a thought-provoking and interesting session today. I think while it's true that we're navigating in a space with some uncertainties and lots of assumptions, I think the session today has confirmed that the cost of the status quo and of failing to build resilience is very high. So a key reflection from what I heard today is the need to look at building resilience at multiple scales and also from multiple dimensions. I think that came out quite a lot in the discussions. And also the need to engage early and continuously with our counterparts to ensure their buy-in and understanding and even interest for assessing scenarios and having these conversations and building in resiliency measures. And linked to that is also I think our role in being strong and effective advocates for more resilient infrastructure in Asia. And the decision makers, want us to move away from theories and abstractions and be clear on what we should do and how to do it, and be able to clearly express how it will be good for the country or city dwellers. So, focusing on the benefits. And we need to engage early and often, as part of this advocacy with our counterparts, I think. So with that, I'd now like to bring today's session to a close, and a sincere thank you to our presenters and speakers for taking the time to share their work and experiences with us and for moderating the breakout discussions. I'd also like to thank each participant for your engagement throughout today's webinar. And the topic of the next webinar in this ADB series will be on achieving resilient water infrastructure and systems. The webinar focusing on water will be held on Wednesday, 24th of March at 2 p.m. Manila time. And the aim of the upcoming webinar is to discuss innovation and opportunities towards achieving resilient water infrastructure and systems in ADB's developing member countries. And like today's session, the upcoming webinar will also be interactive, and we hope you can join it and encourage others to join. Further details and registration are available on the website. And also to note, all of today's presentations and other resources, including a recording and summary, will be posted on the website shortly. With that, I wish you all a good afternoon from Manila, and we can close our session on business unusual for today. Bye for now.
Thanks, Viv.
Thanks, bye.